What's up everyone, DJ's here. Today I have a very important topic to discuss with y'all. It's something that happens before you misclick and make that first turn mech. Something that happens before you accidentally attack that pipe seam that was right next to the base you meant to capture. That's right. Today I'm going to be talking about CO selection. Now, CO selection is a very integral part of Advanced Wars and Advanced Wars by Web. However, I feel it's a topic that's often glossed over. For example, when you hear about Eagle, for example, he has great air units, but using him is not as simple as creating more battlecopters and focusing more on air. So today I hope to break down what maps do certain COs perform well on, and how to focus on a CO's strengths. I'm going to be breaking down this into a series where I focus on each tier, and today I'll be focusing on Tier 4 COs. And when I talk about Tier 4, I'm going to refer to the standard format, as there's different formats for standard and fog, and COs can be ranked higher and lower accordingly depending on the type of game.
The Tier 4 trash COs, which include Ada, Flack, Grim, Jake, Jess, Jugger, Cole, and Sonia.
So let's start off with Jake. Now, this might be a controversial opinion, but I think that Jake is the strongest Tier 4 CO overall. Typically, when I'm selecting a CO, I typically start off with Jake by default, and I need to convince myself to use another CO depending on the map. Jake is an incredibly versatile CO, and his superpower is insane. The increased range for artillery can be game-changing, and the planes bonus he gets for his units, let's say a tank, it has the same bonuses for its superpower as Jess does with her superpower. So just a quick show of how to use Jake effectively. This match was me against Starflash 250 on the map Lucifer. I was Jake, he was Adder. I had his superpower stored up at this point. And basically I moved all my artillery this turn and effectively to push him off of the city so I can start capturing next turn. You see, he has to move the medium tank because next turn, this artillery, which is on planes by the way, so it's going to get a 40% bonus, is also going to get +1 range and hit him. And he can't really go on the offensive here because I have all this artillery backing me up. This artillery can even attack something over here if he chooses to attack that infantry, etc. And in the meantime, not just the artillery, but the move bonus will enable this medium tank to move all the way over here in this vicinity and inflict some damage. Overall, like I said, I think Jake is a solid selection. Particularly in maps where there's plenty of planes, which is the majority of maps, and maps where artillery are particularly viable due to the increased range he gets from his CO power and Super CO power. Next up, we've got Adder, or Chatter as some affectionately call him. Now, let me just talk about something real quick. What the hell did they do to him in Dual Strike? Honestly, like, look at him. They ruined him. So, let's fix that. Anyway, Adder, I'd say, is a pretty strong CO in the lower tiers. I'd argue that he's probably the second best overall behind Jake. His power is basically his whole gimmick. He can get it with just 2 stars, so it can come into effect pretty early on in the game. And it can catch opponents who aren't aware of it off guard with their spacing and defense. And even those who are aware of it will have to push back an extra space, ceding you some extra ground in the game, which is pretty nice. Sometimes you don't even need to pop a CO power. You can just use the impact of them thinking you will use it next turn, and it will push them more on the defensive than ordinary. So the question is, when should I use Adder over Jake? I like to ask myself 3 questions before I make a CO selection between Adder and Jake. First is, are mechs viable? Particularly in maps where there's mountain ranges, or bases near the front line, or smaller maps, mechs are more viable, and Adder can make them very, very good by making them have 3 or even 4 movement during his super normal CO powers. So if mechs are viable, typically I'll go with Adder. For example, First Step into Fog is a great map for mechs. I tend to pick Adder there. Seashell Arena, mechs are pretty good at defending properties and some choke points, so I like to choose either Adder or Cole there. The second question I'd ask myself is, how viable are artillery on the map? You see, the less viable artillery are, the more I lean towards Adder over Jake, since Jake makes artillery so much better with the increased range during his powers. So typically if they're not very viable, I basically lean towards Adder. Third is B-copters. How prevalent are B-copters on the map? If they're pretty prevalent, I typically lean a little towards Adder as well, because Jake's Super CO power does not impact B-Copters. They will still have 6 range. Although they will have the planes bonus, they will not get any increased range like Adder's B-Copters will. So typically, if B-Copters are dominating the map, I'll lean a little bit towards Adder. So next up, we got a similar CO to Adder, Cole. Oh man, he's bigger than I remember. It looks kind of like a plump penguin or something. Anyway, Adder's usually better in most scenarios. Cole's better in maybe a few maps, maybe like Last Vigil where there's a lot of roads. Just keep in mind that he doesn't get his bonus from bridges, so it has to be a road. Although area units do still get the bonus, but there's only a few maps like Last Vigil and Cecil Lock Arena where I've lost to a Cole before, where he can be pretty applicable. But overall, 9 times out of 10, maybe even more frequently, I choose Adder over Cole. Next up, we got Jess, and she's pretty bad in my opinion. I really don't use her very often. Her day-to-day is, decent for her vehicles, 10%. Basically, Jake gets the same thing if he's on planes, except Jess also loses 10% attack for her infantry, which is pretty big deal regarding the capture game, interrupting caps, etc. And the air unit's 10% isn't as big a deal as the infantry, but it's still not pleasant. Her CO power and super CO power aren't that great either. Basically, for her CO power, she just gets a 20% increase to her vehicle attack. And that's after you add in the super or the CO bonus. So she gets basically a 10% bonus from the CO, just using a CO power, just like Adder would from using his CO power. And then she gets a measly 10% more. And then she gets to move 1 extra space for just her vehicles. That's pretty terrible in my opinion. Superpower is a little bit better. She gets 40% overall. The same as Jake's does for his superpower on planes, except she only gets it for her vehicles. And she, of course, she gets, movement spaces as well. 1 movement extra for her CO power, 2 movement for her super CO power. But I still find her overwhelming a lot of the time. If I were to use Jess, I'd typically use her on maps where, the bases are farther apart, so vehicles are more involved in the game rather than infantry. Smaller maps, infantry dominates, so it'd probably have to be a pretty big map where I would consider using Jess, where there's tons of tanks, probably less use of air units as well. So basically a huge map with like no airports or docks or ports or whatever you call them. So her applicability is pretty limited. So next up we got big boy Grim. And although Grim does have a net 10% gain, he has an increase of 30% in his attack and then a negative 20 for his defense, he's actually pretty bad because defense is a lot more important than offense in this game due to the nature of how defense and terrain stack. And I might go into detail in the video later on this, but just know that defense is a lot more important than offense in Advanced Wars. And his role is basically as a wall breaker. However, he doesn't really consistently kill infantry walls with his tanks. You see, even with a comm tower, Grim doesn't consistently kill opposing infantry on planes. Whereas if someone else happens to use even an Adder CO power, will easily break through his infantry on planes with their own tanks. Here are a few calcs demonstrating of how bad Grim actually is. And in some games, he can't even effectively protect his artillery or even tanks using infantry shields. Basically, any firepower bonus will mow him over. His only hope of wall breaking himself is when he pops a CO power or a super CO power. So he's not very good. I will add the caveat that he's better in fog because infantry walls are less of a factor in fog, and the element of surprise is more of a factor. So he can come out swinging and randomly one-shot a unit and you wouldn't be expecting it. But in standard, when everything's very calculated, you're not going to do very well as Grim. So growing up, Sonia was my favorite CO in Advanced Wars, and I still like her a lot. I've come to realize she's not as great as I used to think she was, but I still enjoy using her a lot. Bottom line is, don't use her in standard. You can meme on your opponent or something if you're much better than them, and, whatever, you can still beat them, that's great. But if you're on equal footing and you use Sonia versus any of the other tier 4 COs, you're probably going to lose. Fog is another story. She's much better in Fog. A great support CO. If you're doing a team game, Vision is king. So Sonia's a great support CO for team games. However, she's tier 3 when you go to Fog. She moves up from tier 4 in Standard, where she's unusable, to tier 3 in Fog, where she competes with the likes of Andy, who's much better. So Typically, I don't really pick her that much anymore, unless it's a team game. I do like her CO power. If you manage to get an early income lead, you can basically like lock down on defense using your CO power at a given time. She's not a bad CO. And Fog. So Sonia used to be my favorite CO, but now Flack is my favorite CO. Flack is just so fun to use, like you never know if you're gonna roll high or low. The thing about Flack and Jugger is they're banned from Global League, so I'm not really gonna go too much into detail. Free Flack, bring him back. So until they are allowed in Global League, I'm not gonna go too much into detail. Just a lot of fun to use. I use them as much as I can when I'm not doing Global League. I hope that was helpful for y'all when you're all choosing your next CO for a map. Now you know some rules to go by when selecting a CO, which COs to avoid if you're trying to play for serious. Yeah, best of luck. Good luck out there in the global leagues.